Welcome into another edition of the CFF Sites Preseason Preview Series, where today we're going to talk about the Sun Belt Conference. Mike, look, after today's show, we are basically halfway through these conferences. This will be it for the G5. After this, we transition over to the P5. So we're going to publish these over the course of a couple of weeks on the site. But as we get into Sun Belt, we were talking right before we started to record, a lot of teams here in this conference. So quite a few fantasy assets we're going to be talking about. Anything in particular that's sort of an overlying theme for the Sun Belt before we jump into this, or anything in review of the G5s before we kind of finish them up?
Not any overwhelming thoughts here. I mean, we got some high-end talent, obviously, that we'll get to with Marshall. And then some intriguing situations I think we're going to close with, especially at Texas State. That's been a hot button topic in drafts, especially recently, which we'll dive into later. But fun conference, especially with the amount of teams now that they have in the Sun Belt.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of quality teams too. I mean, adding Marshall, Southern Miss last year, I mean, it really has done well for, even James Madison, right, has done well for the competition in the conference. Maybe a conference that was once kind of dominated by App State. Now, it's sort of a wide open race. But let's start there, Mike, because App State coming into this year, they're going to have a new quarterback. They're moving on from Chase Bryce. They're bringing offensive coordinator Frank Ponce back after spending a year as the offensive coordinator out at Miami. They get Nate Noel back, so there is a trusted name in the backfield there. But we know this is App State. They go deep in the backfield as well. So you may have some fantasy owners out there considering guys like Amani Marshall as well. And then you've got like Deshaun Davis, Christian Horn at receiver. So from the App State offense, what are you looking at? What should fantasy owners be looking at on draft day for App State?
I mean, just the running backs. Kind of same as it always has been, right? It's all about the running backs, and it's all about how they're going to divvy up the carries, which is tough to project because you look back, Frank Ponce, this coaching staff, you have evidence of both, right? You got seasons where the running back one is getting 200 carries. And then you have, 50-50 split between the running back one, running back two. Yep. And you kind of hinted at it. They got a lot of depth, right? Monty Marshall, some people like Kanye Roberts, a redshirt freshman. They brought in a Navy transfer, Mikael Haywood, who kind of flashed in the spring. So how do they divvy up the carries, I think? And Nate Noel, I think the last time that, Frank Ponce was calling the plays, he had a really good season, right? 1,100 yards, 199 carries.
Yeah, he did. In 21, he had 1,100 yards. He carried the ball 199 times. Now, that was 14 games. But to your point, that was the year he split carries with Cameron Peoples. Peoples had 30 fewer carries that year, still finished with over 900 yards, and he was the touchdown vulture with 14 touchdowns. And so I think that's more of the concern for me moving into this year. Look, Noel's not small. He's 5'10", 190. That's not small. But if there is a bigger back, you just wonder if they're going to revert more to that 2021 Thunder and Lightning, where Noel is more of a yardage guy, and there is the threat of some sort of short yardage back in that offense. I would think, based on years past, I would be ready to pounce on an Appalachian State running back. But this year, there seems to be a lot of hesitancy right now because, like you mentioned, there is some depth and the possibility that we may get a number of, heads carrying the ball in that backfield.
Yeah, I think you can bank on one thing. Well, several things. We know they're going to run the football 56% of the time in the last decade, I think, for App State. So we know they're going to run the football. The offensive line should be really good. I think they bring back 4 starters. They brought in 3 P5 transfers to bolster that unit, so it should be really good again. Here's the I don't know if it's going to necessarily throw a wrench into the situation. The projected quarterback, Ryan Berger, who I have to admit, never seen play football in my life, but just kind of reading about him, he's expected to kind of run the ball the way like Zach Thomas did a few years ago, and Taylor Lamb. Does that factor into kind of how the division of carries is split in that backfield too, because you're adding another guy that could get 80 to 100 carries. So, they're going to be good at running the football. Just how much Nate Noel or whomever is going to get, a steady dosage of carries.
Yeah, and I think just to put a bow on it at the receiver, 2 years ago when Ponce was the OC, there were 3 receivers that caught at least 50 passes in that offense, caught at least 50 passes, 800 yards, and 6 touchdowns. So there was a tendency to spread the ball around for 3 receivers in that offense. But you mentioned if Berger ends up the starter and he actually runs the ball a little bit more, you just wonder, that pass run ratio, how skewed will it be? Depending on how efficient they are, running the ball, if they're using Berger that way as well, right?
Sure. Absolutely. Yep.
Now let's go over to Arkansas State, Mike, where Corey Rucker is back after spending a year over at South Carolina. Does that mean much to you this year? Jeff Foreman comes back as well. So they've got some names that we're familiar with and have been familiar with some time now for college fantasy football. When you look at the quarterback spot, though, is it going to be JT Shroud? Is it going to be Jackson Daly? What's your feeling on the Arkansas State offense this year? Is there anyone maybe other than Corey Rucker you would even consider right now?
Not really. Jeff Foreman, he popped in the spring game,
yep.
Which, he's done that the last 3 years. It seems like that he's popped in the spring game and then eventually done relatively little in the regular season. It is nice that he gained 20 pounds this off season. So maybe, he's improved from that standpoint. And I don't know if that helps him or not as a receiver, but I think the weapons are there for Arkansas State, which they usually have pretty good ones. Foreman, Rucker, brought in Courtney Jackson at receiver, should play slot. So that's a really good trio of wideouts. Especially for a Sun Belt team, but who's getting him the football? Like, I don't have any confidence in JT Shroud, even if he, wins the starting job. He was terrible last year at Colorado, less than 50% completion rate, more interceptions than touchdowns. So I'm hopeful Jackson Daly, the redshirt freshman, wins that starting job. So, maybe some youth in that quarterback room can win out a more talented option. Outside of that, I don't know, running backs rarely relevant in that Arkansas State offense. They usually split it up a little bit, and it's usually a high volume passing offense as it is. So probably Rucker, and you'll stream a guy at receiver if you have to, and that's about it for me. How about you?
Yeah, no, I think that's it as well. I just wonder, if the patience is getting a little thin with this coaching staff now, and because it doesn't seem like Arkansas State has made any improvement over the last couple of years. So, you just wonder if there might be some change coming if there's another bad year at Arkansas State.
Yeah, I would agree. I think Butch Jones is probably safe for right now, but his offensive coordinator, I know that the fan base has been, I think, throwing some of the blame towards him. So I can see a change there if things don't go right this year.
Yep. And talking about change, let's head over to Coastal Carolina, where most of the offense comes back, particularly at the skill positions, but there's a change at the top. Jamie Chadwell went over to Liberty. We discussed that in one of our other shows, but Tim Beck comes over to take over the program. He's bringing in Travis Trickett, who I believe was the OC at South Florida last year. I know you and I have discussed this. You're not particularly high on this coaching staff, even though when you look at what they have to play with, you've got Grayson McCall back. You've got some running backs there as well. You've got the leading receiver returning. Well, the top 2 receivers are actually back, I believe. So, you've got Sam Pinckney back, Jared Brown, running back Braden. Braden Bennett missed most of the year last year, or if not all the year. So he's back this year. So there's a lot of experience returning with Coastal, but there's turnover in the coaching staff. What is that doing for for the fantasy appeal of these players? And what are we seeing with Coastal Carolina players in some of the drafts you've been participating in this spring and summer?
Yeah, I'm excited for Coastal Carolina if the coaching staff doesn't get in the way, because we like the returning talent. Obviously,
Yep.
you mentioned it, Grayson McCall at quarterback, very good. The receiving core is mostly intact, and then the top 3 running backs are also back. So, as I'm not a Tim Beck fan. He didn't do well at NC State the last 3 years. They never finished above 8th in the ACC in offense. Extenuating circumstances last year with Devin Leary, but that offense just kind of trended downward each season. People I know like the Travis Trickett hiring at OC. He's never had an offense that scored more than 30 points per game as an offensive play caller, but I mean, he did well with the pieces last year at Southern USF, which was not much to work with. Mm-hmm. So I think people are higher on him than maybe I am, and you as well. But I think it's the returning talent at Coastal Carolina that has people excited, because I mean, Grayson McCall, very good, right? The top 2 receivers, very good.
Well, yeah, and I would like to think that the fact that with the turnover in coaching staff, Grayson McCall's return, remember, if you remember right, he hit the portal early on, right after the season, and then he withdrew, I believe. Him coming back really, really kind of saved, I think, this offense and will make it relevant. And I do think Coastal will be good, but to your point, how efficient will they be, and will the coaching staff get in the way? Because Coastal's got enough, they're going to be they should be one of the better offenses in this conference, right?
I agree.
On paper.
On paper, yeah, I agree. 2 things I think stuck out to me with Coastal in the research of, in particular, the offensive coordinator, Travis Trickett. One, all 5 seasons that he was the offensive coordinator in the last decade, outside receiver has been his wide receiver 1, so that bodes well for Sam Pinckney. And then 2, we I think both were but we were higher on Braden Bennett last year. Thought he could be an explosive back in that offense. I think what bodes well, and Travis Trickett will typically spread the carries around, but he loves to throw to his running backs. And I think they've averaged around 25 catches per season. When he was the offensive coordinator at Georgia State, his running back one of those seasons had 60 targets and 47 receptions. So maybe if Braden Bennett, fully healthy, wins that starting job, maybe he could have some value in a PPR format.
Yep, no doubt. Well, let's go over to James Madison, where, change of quarterback this year. Todd Centeio was the starting quarterback last year. Chris Thornton, had a lot of hype last year in college fantasy football, rightfully so, had a hot start last year. We've gone back and forth on whether or not Jordan McLeod will start at quarterback for James Madison. So that's TBD, right? But you've got running backs like Kalen Black, Latrell Palmer. You've got some running backs that can tote the ball. Reggie Brown comes back. They've got some receivers. Amari Dollison's he's there as well. How are we looking at this offense compared to where we looked at it a year ago? Because I know, speaking for myself, if you remember back a year ago, I had Todd Centeio as one of my sleepers. I think I think I was on that one pretty good. But we're a little uncertain about quarterback right now, and whether or not Reggie Brown can kind of assume that role that Chris Thornton had last year. Where's the value for you in this offense right now in drafts as we, move into the 23 season here with James Madison?
I think the value would be Reggie Brown. I looked pre-show. He's going, as of mid-June, he's going as wide receiver 61. And I mean, that feels, I think you would agree. It's just kind of, we believe he's going to be the wide receiver 1 in this offense. We're not as certain as we were last year with Chris Thornton, but he seems to be the guy this year. And last 4 wide receivers in this offense have averaged around 14 fantasy points per game, if not more. So wide receiver 61, probably definitely in the double digit rounds in your draft. So he's kind of the value in this offense. If there's a quarterback that can get him the ball consistently, I'm not sure, right? If you kind of read up on the quarterback situation during the spring, it was not good. Like Jordan McLeod, he separated himself from the rest of the group, but it wasn't it was more how poorly the rest of the group performed versus how good Jordan McLeod was. I'm tentative to draft him, but I also wasn't on Todd Centeio last year, and look what happened, right? Averaged 30 fantasy points per game. So currently, right now, it's between Jordan McLeod and Alonzo Barnett, a redshirt freshman, and we'll kind of see how that transpires during fall camp.
Yep. And just real quick to kind of put a bow on the running backs, we've got Black and Palmer there, 1-2. Black was a freshman last year. Palmer was a junior. So obviously they come back as sophomores and seniors. Both of them ran for 300 yards. Palmer 5 touchdowns, Black 3. We've got Black, the younger player, played fewer games last year, averaged more yards per carry, kind of giving him the edge right now going into the season, right?
Yeah, Latrell Palmer wasn't very good last year. I think he averaged like 3 yards a carry, maybe something like that. So we'll go.
He was less than 4 yards a carry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say any of the running backs are worth drafting like last round of a 30-round best ball, maybe for Kalon Black. It's a passing offense, pass first offense, and they get the quarterback involved in the running game. So.
Yeah, well, look, talking about pass-first offense, let's go over to Georgia Southern, right, where they bring in Davis Brin. He's probably going to be the starting quarterback this year. They get Jalen White back at running back. Gerald Green transferred out. Green had almost 500 yards and 6 touchdowns himself, but White had over 900 yards and 10 touchdowns in 11 games. So, maybe pushing that 1,000-yard mark had he got a full 12 games, and he's back this year. And then when you look at the receiving core, they got Derwin Burgess. He's back. Caleb Hood's back. They got the Syracuse transfer, Anthony Quealy in. What are you looking at from the Georgia Southern offense this year? Where's the value for you right now? Obviously, we've got Burgess up there high in the receiver rankings. White's a pretty decent value at running back. Let's talk about the Georgia Southern offense real quick and some of the players from a value standpoint.
Yeah, I think you're seeing some of the secondary players creep up a little bit. Like I think everybody was high on Derwin Burgess to start, spring and off season when those early best balls. But, Caleb Hood was going in double-digit rounds. That's no longer the case. You have to draft him in rounds 7, 8, 9 at this point. And with good reason too. He's going to get 100 targets this season. Davis Brin is just, I feel like he's skyrocketing in drafts now. Is that a good not that it's not a I don't what am I saying, like is that, should he be going that high in drafts, because now he's being drafted within the first 10 to 12 rounds. He's a non-runner, but he's going to throw it 40 times a game. I believe Georgia Southern was second in the country in pass play percentage, so from that standpoint he's going to chuck it around. And I think you would agree too, like, Kyle Van Treese was pretty good last year, and Davis Brin is probably the better player of the two. So you would think that he's going to put up at least those kinds of numbers, if not better, this year.
Well, when you look at the pass attempts last year, Van Treese averaged over 40. He averaged about 46 pass attempts per game, right? He finished with a 27-16 touchdown to interception ratio. Now, over at Tulsa, Brin had a 17-8 touchdown to interception ratio. So I think, to your point, they're going to put the ball in the air a ton. Is Brin better than Van Treese? That's debatable. But I think Brin's numbers speak for themselves in the fact that he might be just as careless. Look, he's going to throw the ball a lot. He had 8 interceptions at Tulsa last year. Van Treese had 16. There's nothing in Davis Brin to suggest to me that he's not going to, I think he's going to be in the double digits for interceptions for sure. I just curious to see how, can he match the 27 touchdowns and 4,200 yards that Van Treese put up last year? I think it's possible. And also, to your point with Caleb Hood, I remember early in the spring we were talking about this, and I was looking at some of the ADP that you were sharing with me, and quite frankly, I was really surprised at how low Hood was going, considering he had 87 catches for 900 yards last year. Now, I think the value, the reason why it wasn't there, and there were a lot of people turning away or shying away from him, was that he only caught 3 touchdowns. There were three other players on the team, Derwin Burgess, Amari Jones, and tight end J.J. McAfee, that actually had more than him. But my point is you give me a receiver that's going to catch 85 plus passes and get over 100 targets a year. I'm going to play the law of averages and say maybe those touchdowns go up this year. And so I do like Hood now where he's getting drafted as opposed to where he was getting drafted earlier in the spring.
Well, I think earlier in the spring, I think part of that was stupidly that we didn't realize that Caleb Hood was back for another year, which happens early in the offseason, right? With all these eligibility issues. I kind of looked at it a little bit, and don't get me wrong, I really like Caleb Hood, but like he is strictly a slot receiver. And if you compare him to Derwin Burgess, Burgess had 11.9 average depth of target, only 7.6 yards average depth of target for Caleb Hood. So I'm hesitant to say that his touchdown numbers will increase dramatically, because I think that's just not his particular role in the offense. So,
well, look, the other two receivers aside from Derwin Burgess last year, the other top two receivers beside Burgess, Jeremy Singleton and Caleb Hood. Jeremy Singleton still had 65 catches last year, 700 yards. Of course, he only had 2 touchdowns. Amari Jones had 6. Are we, from a value standpoint, what about Anthony Quealy later in drafts? Like, I feel like he's the guy that really kind of like being, everybody's looking at Hood and Burgess. You might be able to sneak a guy like him if he's going to be the wide receiver 3, really in some end of a draft, and take a shot with him. And maybe he's a guy that catches 60 plus passes as well and finds 5 to 8 touchdowns this year.
100% agree. I think it's just the uncertainty that they don't know, or we and others don't know for sure that he's going to be the wide receiver 3. It does seem like that's going to be the case, and that's 100 targets that Jeremy Singleton had last year. And if Anthony Quealy gets that, I haven't seen him drafted once in a best ball. So absolutely great point. Take a shot on him in drafts.
Now, what about running back Jalen White? He's back. 160 carries in 11 games last year. He caught 20 plus passes, had 11 total touchdowns. Gerald Green is gone. They do have, some. It's not like the backfield is barren. OJ Arnold does return. For anybody looking at Jalen White or considering Jalen White, do you see any significant bump in numbers and productions this year? Or because I'm kind of feeling like last year numbers kind of feel like the ceiling again this year. Are we aligned on that? Or do you think there's potential for him to go higher?
I would say probably just right around what he produced last year. If you look at it over the last decade with this coaching staff, Clay Helton and Brian Ellis, the offensive coordinator, Jalen White's numbers, like his yards per carry, the touchdowns he finished with, it is literally right in line with what we've seen from the running back 1 year. So this is pass first offense. I think if Georgia Southern is better offensively with Davis Brin, then potentially, you could see a slight bump, but I wouldn't expect anything substantially more.
Yep. But I mean, look, 900 yards and 11 total touchdowns, to over 1,000 yards of total offense and double-digit touchdowns is nothing to
scoff at.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, man. Well, look, let's get out of Georgia Southern. Let's go over to Georgia State. Now, we know that traditionally the strength of Georgia State has been to run the ball this year. What are we looking at with Georgia State? Look, Jamari Thrash, we're going to get into him. He was their leading receiver last year. 1,100 yards. He's over now at Louisville, right? So right now, I believe we have Robert Lewis sliding in at that wide receiver 1 role for Georgia State. Let's just kind of start there before we get into the running game. Let's go with the passing game, because usually in this offense, there might only be one significant option. Last year, Lewis caught 6 touchdowns. Thrash had 7. What are you expecting from Robert Lewis this year at Georgia State? Could he possibly match Thrash's numbers from last year, 1,100 yards, 7 touchdowns? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't see it. I was actually looking at that pre-show, and I didn't realize how awful he was last year. He dropped 20% of his targets, which he only had 45 targets. So he dropped 9 drops, which led the team, and conversion rate of only 49% on his 45 targets. So he was legitimately bad last year. Georgia State does have a history now of producing a pretty decent wide receiver one. You look all the way back to like Penny Hart, like
Sure.
5 years ago. I don't see it with Robert Lewis, so I you know,
The only
I
good thing that I will say, if they are able to kind of get some things together, is this passing game lives off of the efficiency of the running game. It's a vertical passing game. Thrash averaged 18 plus a catch last year, and Lewis caught 22 passes and averaged over 17 yards. So really, if the running game can be effective, we know based on the numbers that there are going to be opportunities for him in this passing game. Just whether or not he can convert or they can convert is really going to be the question for him at receiver. But what about the running game? Because, you're looking at Granger. He had 742 rushing yards last year. He led the team in rushing, even though Tucker Gregg had 12 rushing touchdowns. Could we expect similar numbers from the quarterback? And is he going to eat into those running back numbers again?
He's going to get similar carries, similar yardage, probably. We've seen that not only last year, but with previous Georgia State quarterbacks in this offense. For me, with the running game, it's how they're going to divvy up the carries between Marcus Carroll, the projected running back one, and then the explosive backup, KZ Adams, because he has killed it each of the last two spring games. KZ Adams, I'm talking about. He had 150 yards and 4 touchdowns in this most recent spring game. It's just that he's on the smaller side, 175 pounds. So I don't think he's going to be your lead back. That should be Carroll this year. It's just a matter of how they're going to, similar to what we spoke with App State, is how they're going to divvy up the carries. Is it going to be 50-50 like we've seen the last couple of years? There is evidence of a 200 plus carry season way back a few years ago with Trey Barnett. I'm sure you remember that name.
Yes.
So Carroll's going to be the lead guy. It's just a matter of how involved they get KZ Adams in that this year in that back.
Yeah, and I think just to compare, when you look at the numbers last year, Tucker Gregg did average 14 carries a game, and Carroll averaged 10.5 carries a game. And Jameis Williams, he played in 8 games. He averaged 10 carries a game. Granger averaged 13. So they did spread it around a little bit. If that running back rotation can be tightened a bit, and if it's just Carroll and Adams, then, there's the possibility now of all of a sudden 370 carries being split between 2 guys. That might make Carroll a little bit more attractive. So I think the upside is there, particularly since Gregg had double-digit touchdowns last year. He scored 12 rushing touchdowns. To your point, I think Carroll's going to get there to double digits into touchdowns. The question is how big of a volume share he's going to have carrying the ball with KZ Adams and Darren Granger there.
I think that's a great point because I don't think they have a solidified running back 3 right now. So I think it's going to be those top 2 guys carrying the majority of the workload.
Yep. Now look, the same questions over at Louisiana, right? Because, you've got a couple of backs in that backfield. Young guys last year they were high on. Those guys now are probably taken over at the top. We don't really have I don't know if we really have anything solidified on 1-2 right now. We've got Draylon at the top of that depth chart. I think if anything, this year going into the season at Louisiana, Ben Woolridge is sort of the solidified starter there. Last year, there was a lot of, there was alternating and rotation between him and Chandler Fields, particularly early in the game. But Woolridge played well down, at the end of the year. From a fantasy standpoint, I think Louisiana is really tough. I mean, look, the receivers, we know that they're going to spread the ball around. If one of those running backs hit, I feel they can be of some value during the season. I think we're going to have to let it play out a little bit. I'm almost wondering if Ben Woolridge is a little bit under the radar play in some really deep FBS leagues right now, Mike. He had 2 300-yard passing games last year when he kind of took over as the full-time starter. He threw 2 or more touchdown passes in 4 of the last 5 games that he played. What are your thoughts on Louisiana right now? Because for me, it's really hard to identify anybody that I would suggest drafting right now, with the exception of maybe in deep leagues, some type of flyer on Woolridge at the end.
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well. Woolridge, I think he's the best quarterback on the roster. The only issue is that he got injured late in the season, and it sounds like he will be ready for the start of the season, but it's not a sure thing at this point. So that obviously diminishes his value for a team that really doesn't throw the ball as much as you would like. Yeah, so quarterback, I'm kind of out there. Woolridge would be the guy that if I'm choosing someone. Running backs, I looked into it a little bit, and we have Draylen Washington as the projected running back 1 right now.
Right.
He was substantially better than Terrence Williams last year in that backfield. He averaged 2 yards more per carry. Had a better breakaway rush rate on Pro Football Focus. He was better with yards after contact. So I think he can separate himself from Terrence Williams in that backfield. So that's a guy that he hasn't been drafted either in any draft that we've participated in. So I think that's a guy that maybe we look at some point this season if he starts to establish himself as the guy in the backfield. But it's typically a committee, because this coaching staff, which how would you say the head coach's name? Do you know that? The Louisiana native? I'm going to put you on the spot.
Is it
Michael Desormeaux?
I don't know.
Desormeaux?
I'm not looking at it. As a matter of fact, you kind of caught me. The one thing that I was looking up when you were talking, and I think to your point a little bit, is we know they're going to spread it around. I actually just went back and looked at last year. Last year, they averaged just over 35 carries per game in the backfield. That was their lowest team total rush attempts per game since 2011. So they really didn't juice the ball on the ground as well as they have in previous years. I'm wondering if they can make a sort of, revive that running game this year. And if so, then we possibly could get some value out of the running backs. But for me right now, it is a wait and see. I still think Louisiana is going to be one of the better teams in this conference. But to your point, there's just nobody really that I've got on my radar on draft day right now on this roster.
No, I think you could potentially see 3 quarterbacks this year, even though we like Woolridge best. We don't know for sure who's going to be that running back 1, and then you're never owning anybody at receiver in this offense. So, agreed. A good team, but stay away for fantasy perspective.
Yep. Now, look, let's go over to Marshall, where there is no question about what we're thinking in the backfield on this one, right? Rasheen Ali is back, one of our top running backs. We can spend a minute and talk about what happened last year, but, I just think it was a little odd that he comes back late in the year and he's got a big old knee brace on, and there was a lot of speculation about what was going on with him, and just wonder whether he had a serious knee injury leading up to the season. But look, he came back the last game or two and looked good. Much to the dismay of a lot of Kalen Laburn's fans, he was just a monster all year. And then they bring back Rasheen Ali in college fantasy football playoff time. But Mike, he's one of our top running backs on the board this year. Is there anything outside of Rasheen Ali that we should be looking at?
I don't think so. I think the conversation here is Rasheen Ali running back 1 this year in college fantasy? Because I like right now, I think consensus among most is Quinshon Judkins, but there isn't a system, I don't think, in college football over the last 2 years that is as surefire as the Marshall running back 1. You got 250 carries for the running back 1 each of the last 2 years. And there's nobody competing with Rasheen Ali for that starting job for even a healthy split of carries. I think it's Rasheen Ali's job, and as long as he's fully healthy,
if Ali has regained the explosiveness that he had in 21, I like him.
Yeah,
I like him.
I agree. Offensive line should be really good this year for Marshall.
Yeah.
It's just, I think the question marks just come at the other positions, right? Quarterback is, and wide receiver is a complete mess. We really don't have a good idea of who's going to step in at receiver for Corey Gamage, who left via the portal. So I think
Well, Gamage is out. Cam Fancher's in at quarterback. He was serviceable at the end of the year. They brought in TJ McMahon, I believe, over from Rice. Cade Conley transferred in at tight end from Central Michigan. So there's at least some names that we're familiar with. But like you said, I think right now everything centers around Rasheen Ali in this offense. And from there, it's going to be kind of just a wait and see.
Yeah, I would say just hypothetically thinking, you mentioned the injury. As long as he's fully healthy, I would say he's already got a good amount of carries under his belt at his career, plus the injury that he had last year. Like, this is his money year. So I would expect, because I don't know what his NFL draft prospects are, but I would expect him to put it fully into this year and then parlay that into either a career in the NFL or maybe try and get a bag at a Power 5 conference. So I think this is his money year to really show out.
Yeah, and I'm hoping to be one of the where he'd have a good year and possibly go pro, because when you look at his 21, if he does anything close to that, I don't even know why he would come back unless the pay is good in college football now, Mike. So
somebody will pay him.
No, that's right. Well, look, maybe that's the case at Old Dominion and why everybody jumped ship, right? Look, Hayden Wolf no longer there. Blake Watson's over at Memphis, running back. He transferred out. Ali Jennings, the receiver, he transferred over to Virginia Tech. So a little bit of a clean slate here over at Old Dominion. We've got, right now we've probably got Javon Harvey as sort of the most valued fantasy asset on the Old Dominion roster right now. But what are you looking at from Old Dominion, considering we've got the new offensive coordinator, Kevin Decker there? He comes over from Fordham. Intriguing option at offensive coordinator, but, will we see year one success or as much as we'd like in this year in 2023 from him?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a wait and see for Old Dominion players outside of Javon Harvey, because I think it's pretty clear that he's going to be the wide receiver one. And I think it's, game scripts probably work in his favor where the wide receiver one should be able to produce at Old Dominion right out of the gate. But this, for those that are unfamiliar, they hired Kevin Decker, the former Fordham OC, and they exploded last year. 78 plays per game, 400 passing yards per game. The top two running backs accounted for over 2,000 rushing yards. So this is going to be a fast-paced offense. It's the veer and shoot that is currently employed at like Tennessee and other places around the country. Baylor used to run that system too. So we know that type of offense is going to be explosive. It's going to be fast-paced. All the things that we like from a college fantasy perspective. It's just a matter of if they have the talent level to produce right out of the gates, like you said.
Yep. Now, what about South Alabama, Mike? Because there's a lot proven there, right? Carter Bradley back at quarterback, LaDamian Webb back at running back. They get Devin Voisin. I think that's how you say it. Three of their top four receivers are back. Colin Lacey's back. Both of those guys caught at least 64 passes and 5 touchdowns last year. Tight end DJ Thomas Jones, he's back. He had 24 catches and 4 touchdowns. So South Alabama projected to be one of the better teams in the conference this year, one of the better offenses in the conference this year. I think for me, the question is what kind of fantasy potential does LaDamian Webb have? And I think really it just lies in how healthy can he stay this year? Are you kind of under the same impression this year with Webb, where for me right now, he seems the most attractive, had 210 rush attempts last year, but he seemed like he was dinged up here or there. And it was either like it was a home run or a strikeout with him.
Yeah, I think that's part of the issue. I think the other issue with Webb is just the depth or perceived depth that South Alabama is bringing back, because based on the quotes, they're really high on the backup, Braylon McReynolds. And then they brought in 2 P5 transfers. Well, they have 2 P5 transfers behind them. I know Kentrell Bullock came in this year from Ole Miss. So there should be depth behind them. And those 200, I was looking back at Major Applewhite, the offensive coordinator, and the 209 carries that LaDamian Webb had last year were the most ever from a running back one under Applewhite. So, you like the depth in the backfield, the coaching staff says, past history says that maybe the 209 carries that he got last year is kind of the ceiling that he might get. Plus, you add in, he's kind of banged up a little bit last year. I don't have any shares. I know others are higher on him. I think we would both agree that this is going to be a really, really good South Alabama offense. So scoring opportunities are going to be there for Webb.
Yeah, it is. And he's a player. He's one of those players I'm really torn on right now, because you mentioned 209, 210 rush attempts. There was a 2-game span where he only had 10 carries, right? So he very easily could have had 230 plus carries at the end of the year last year. Before he got dinged up, he had scored a touchdown in 4 of the first 5 games. He had 75 more yards or more in the first 5 games last year. So he was off to a really good start, but he scored 13 touchdowns. He only scored in 6 games. There was a 2-game span where he scored 7 touchdowns in 2 games. So I think those kind of skew the touchdown numbers. And to my point, there were 4 of his last 6 games that he played during the year in which he had fewer than 50 rushing yards. So in some sense, it was almost like a tale of 2 seasons with LaDamian Webb last year. And injury did play a part of that. So that's why I feel he's really an intriguing option this year, because I do think, based on what we saw last year and how good the South Alabama offense is going to be, he does have potential to go over 200 carries again and 1,000 yards. And if he does that, there's no reason why he shouldn't get double-digit touchdowns again. But to your point, you wonder if they look at the health issue and try to incorporate that running back 2 there a little bit more.
Yep. I think you painted a good picture there. I think just the amount of scoring opportunities that he should have. Just, you bring back Carter Bradley, you have a really solid wide receiver core. I don't know that anybody's a standout in that group, but it's rock solid. And then 4 starters back in the offensive line. I don't think there's any reason that this offense should take a step back from a points per game standpoint.
Well, Mike, let's switch over from South Alabama to Southern Miss, where we're going to talk about a player. We just talked about LaDamian Webb, but Frank Gore, 121 carries in 2020, 179 in 2021, 228 carries last year for 1,300 yards. I'm really high on Frank Gore. He is the engine of that offense, does everything. Matter of fact, you were like, man, Joe, I remember you telling me this. We've got to project him for passing numbers this year, because it's inevitable he's going to end up taking some snaps this year. I really like Gore this year. Do you feel the same this year with Gore at running back this year, high up on your list?
I don't have any shares except for in Dynasty, but I don't think I'm where you're at. He's kind of in that LaDamian Webb kind of bubble for me. If you look back, a quarter of the games that he played in last season, he failed to score 12 fantasy points. He really, a good chunk of his fantasy points came in that last month of the season, especially that bowl game where he had 49 fantasy points. So I like him, top 15 running back, but I'm not going out of my way to draft him. I think what helps is that quarterback position can't be any worse than it was last year. So, feasibly the offense should be better if the quarterback plays better. And then the offensive line is going to be really good. 4 starters back with 87 career starts. So I see, good and bad with Frank Gore's fantasy prognosis.
I think when I look at Gore a little bit deeper and I look at his numbers, they really struggled look, without a quarterback, that team struggled, right? Make no mistakes about it. But when you look at the games that they were in, when they gave him 19 carries, in the 7 games he had at least 19 rushing attempts, he scored a touchdown in 5 of those 7 games and did well in just about, from a fantasy standpoint, in every single one of those games. There were some games where he had 13, 11, 7 carries. So to your point, there were times when he just didn't do much at all. But when they were feeding him the ball, then he was actually pretty good. And I just wonder if Southern Miss is actually going to have a quarterback this year and they're going to be a little bit more efficient on offense. And if so, I still think that Gore's numbers could even be higher. Now, that might be too optimistic. I don't have any shares of him myself right now. but it just, he's in that area for me where there's maybe just one or two other options when I'm on the draft, when I'm on the clock, that I feel a little bit better with than him. But make no mistake about it, he's a solid fantasy option this year at running back.
Yeah, he's been going like late second, early third, and I would draft him probably around later, late third, early fourth. It's just my preference. I will say this too. I was just looking at this. I know you like to take a deeper dive into the schedules of players. Alcorn State, Florida State, Tulane, and then you get into the Sun Belt schedule. Actually, they do have Mississippi State in week 12, which would be your semifinal week. So I guess might not be playable then, but you could get a hot start right out of the gate. You're not going to start them against Florida State, but Alcorn State and Tulane, and then some Arkansas State's not going to prevent him from scoring points. Louisiana Monroe. So schedule's not terrible. It's that semifinal week of your playoff stretch that you might not start him against Mississippi State.
And I think just to touch on receiver just a tad, and the reason why I say that is because, when you look at Jason Brownlee's numbers, he's led the team in receiver for the last 3 years. So that wide receiver one is usually locked in at the top spot. He did have 8 touchdown catches in back-to-back seasons his last 2 years there. Are we looking at Jacarius Caston right now? We have him projected in that wide receiver one spot. Are we still feeling comfortable with him right now in that wide receiver one spot if you're maybe looking on a flyer at a Southern Miss receiver late in the draft?
Yeah, I would say it's Caston. They have another guy, Tia Kellen Mims, who stepped in when Caston was injured last year. Had a good, really good, like 2 to 3 game stretch. I won't focus too much on the receivers here, but I think the issue with Caston and Mims is that they both play the slot receiver role. So if I don't know if they're going to shift one guy outside, there goes my dog. If they're going to shift one guy outside, or if they keep them both in the slot and somebody gets eliminated. So I'm steering clear, and we'll see what happens on waivers, maybe with Southern Miss receivers.
Yep. Now, Mike, over at Troy, Kamani Vidal tore up the last half of the season, or really maybe the last quarter or last third of the season. There were some leagues where I mentioned if you had him, you probably got into your semifinals or finals just from his performance alone. Finished with 1,100 yards last year, 10 touchdowns, had 2 200-yard games in the last 4 games of the season, and scored 7 of his 10 touchdowns during that stretch. Why aren't we higher on him going into 2023?
I don't have a great answer for you, to be honest. I mean, the workload was there, and the workload's going to be there with this offensive staff. I looked at the offensive line play, maybe thinking that was the reason that he only averaged 4.9 yards per carry, which is not terrible, but sure. Right. You wanted better with the substantial workload that he got, and 48th in stuff rate, the offensive line. So he's not really, he's getting to the line of scrimmage. 83rd in line yards, not terrible. So the offensive line, I don't think was an issue. I don't know. The workload's going to be there. I don't have a great answer for you as to why we're not higher on Kamani Vidal this year. Because
that's why I like talking about this, and that's why we do the show. Right? We've got Asa Martin there, as the running back too. When you look back at Vidal last year, and you look back at that Troy running game, because Troy is going to be pretty good again this year. There was a stretch in the middle of the season where DK Billingsley was sort of getting the bulk of the work in that backfield. He had 3 85+ yard games in the middle of the season. And so the more I go a little bit in depth on the Troy running game, if Kamani Vidal is going to be that true running back one all year, I'm starting to think I might be a little bit lower on him than I may be warming up to moving him up a little bit if he is going to be locked into that running back one spot, because I'm looking last year, they kind of divided things up during the season, and Vidal really took off down the stretch. And I'm wondering, man, am I too low on him if he gets that full workload in that backfield as running back one this year? But he's just not, he's more of that, he's that workhorse back. He's not that electric game breaker type back. And I think that's where we kind of look at and say, maybe it is maybe he's going to be that 20 carry touchdown every week type running back for the Troy offense this year.
I mean, how many years do we wait on Kamani Vidal to kind of break out, right? So I've always liked Kamani Vidal, but I don't know. I don't want to say he's bad, but maybe he's not as good as we kind of perceive him to be. So,
well, consistency is the reason why he's not higher. Let's just be honest. That's the reason why he's not up higher on the list. It's just a consistency issue from him. I mean, that's all it really is. I mean, it's just we've got a small sample size, and this what makes projecting college fantasy football so great is that sometimes we've got to use, some of the hunches that we have in addition to some of the historical data. And we just talked about guys with, Frank Gore and some other guys that talk about, can they kind of avoid the injury bug or can they stay healthy? The same thing, maybe it's not the injury bug with Vidal, but there's just been consistency issues throughout his career at Troy.
Yeah, absolutely. And he had some injury issues too, but yeah, consistency was a factor. The one I wanted to hit on one player before we moved on with Troy. I think most people were semi-high on Tez Johnson last year with Troy, and he was relatively productive. I haven't had the courage to draft him, but Jabari Barber is an interesting slot receiver he's going to step in the slot for Tez Johnson. And if you look back, he had more targets through 6 games than Tez Johnson did last season. So before his season-ending injury. So just the name that I wanted to throw out there as potentially a late-round target in drafts.
Yeah, sure. You 2 teams left, Mike. UL Monroe, and then we're going to close it with Texas State and talk about that quarterback position. But UL Monroe right now, is there anything in that offense that really is appealing going into the 2023 season with UL Monroe right now?
Not really. Tyrone Howell, we realized very late. Again, this is another eligibility issue. We realized late that he's still on the roster. And he did have I think 250-yard game, like 3 touchdowns.
Yeah.
At one point last year.
New quarterback though, Chandler Rogers is gone.
Yep. The issue is he's probably a best ball only candidate because sandwich in between those, like a couple 30-point games that he had, there's a 6-point game, 3.9, 9.3 fantasy points in there. So they're not going to throw the ball enough to where he's going to give you consistency week to week. So probably a good best ball candidate. Redraft is going to be tough. I can't even imagine when he do weekly projections, like trying to predict when he's going to have a big performance. So Tyrone Howell is probably the only player that I'm relatively interested in.
Yeah, and look, Malik Jackson led the team in rushing last year. He only had 500 yards, 6 touchdowns. He's now out at Jacksonville State with Rich Rodriguez. And interesting name coming in there that we have projected at running back 1 at UL Monroe. Just to kind of keep on your radar, Thaddeus Franklin, right? Miami transfer.
Yeah, I think the issue is just UL Monroe scored the 6th fewest fantasy points at the running back position, but as he's 240 pounds, P5 transfer, that transfers down. So, those guys could have success.
Now let's get into an interesting one. We're going to end up with Texas State, Mike, and G.J. Kinney coming in to take over the program. He and his offensive coordinator from Incarnate Word last year, Mac Leftwich, comes over. They're at Texas State now. And when Malik Hornsby transferred over to Texas State, there was a lot of hype in the college fantasy football circles about his fantasy potential. Let's talk a little bit about the, Hornsby's fantasy appeal, that, the evolution of it over the last 3 months from what you've seen back in March and April to what we're seeing now in late May, mid-June.
Yeah, he was going in rounds 4 and 5. People were just excited for his fantasy, his dual threat ability, and mostly, let's be honest.
Should we just say, first of all, I think it is important that Kinney's quarterback last year at Incarnate Word, and it completely is slipping my mind right now.
Lindsey Scott.
Lindsey Scott. I want to say he had total 60 something, maybe even 70 touchdowns, right? I mean,
It was absurd.
It was absurd. So when you look at those numbers, the first thing was Malik Hornsby, dual threat ability, this system coming in, playing in the Sun Belt. The attraction was there. And I remember you telling me that, Joe, this guy's going in the third round. This guy, everybody's taking them early right now. I remember those conversations.
It was me. It was, I mean, some others were as well, but I was kind of taking him that highly. But you get that kind of athlete in the Sun Belt. And I mean, you saw it in the spring game too. Like, he was just running past defenders when he was scrambling. The issue is his arm. And obviously, if the coaching staff is bringing in a guy like TJ Finley, they probably didn't see enough in the spring to where they're comfortable with Malik Hornsby as their surefire QB1. I did some research. I reached out to the Texas State beat writer back in May, and I was listening to his podcast too. And I was like, hey, can you give me the details on this situation? And he's comfortable now with TJ Finley as the guy, I think. And you've kind of said this in the past, like, you bring in a guy for a reason in the portal, yes, right? And if you were comfortable enough with Malik Hornsby, I don't think you necessarily would have gone out and gotten a TJ Finley, or he would have committed to Texas State, because you would have told him, hey, you're going to be the backup. So the Texas State beat writer feels comfortable now enough to project that TJ Finley will be the starter week 1. Does that necessarily transpire that way? We'll see. I don't think you're a fan of TJ Finley.
Well, no, it's just it's interesting to me because you're looking at two quarterbacks that have multiple years of eligibility remaining. It's not like they're bringing in one guy and saying, hey, look, this guy could be the starter, wait in the wings, and you got it's your call from here on out. I don't see how both of these guys stay at some. It's going to be hard for me to say that. And the fact that they brought in Finley after Hornsby makes me think that there's a reason they brought him in. Now, for me, Finley's not quite the fantasy, attraction that Malik Hornsby is because of the dual threat ability. And I happen to think that both of them are going to get a chance to play. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. The reason why we're mentioning all of this is because if you're in any type of a best ball format or even traditional format, you're better off handcuffing these guys. Definitely in a best ball format. In a traditional format, you probably need to handcuff them too, because Texas State has the type of offense that a guy's not going to be on the waiver wire long in this offense when they see the way that they're going to open it up. So I think you kind of have to take them both early on and hope that one hits, and then you might be able to free up a roster spot later on. Wouldn't you agree with that though, Mike? In any format that you're playing in, you've got to take both. And if you're taking one, you're really leaving yourself open.
Yeah, especially best ball. Definitely handcuff. Malik Hornsby's, we mentioned that he was going round 4 and 5 probably in April. You can get him probably between rounds 8 and 10 right now. And if you do that, absolutely handcuff with TJ Finley. I personally, even if I haven't drafted Malik Hornsby, if we get beyond round 20, I'm still taking it. I'll draft TJ Finley as a 5th, 6th quarterback and let the chips fall where they may after that.
Well, here's the thing. Let's touch on the running back situation, because this is going to be an offense that we're expecting a lot of points to score a lot of points. The running back, I don't think we're really worried about as much as the receivers. Ashton Hawkins, I like Ashton Hawkins. They brought in Sean Shaw from Iowa. I believe Bo Corrales is there. Julian Ortega-Jones had a solid spring. We've got Charles Brown in that still, I think, that wide receiver 2 spot. I don't know if we've moved anything around on the depth chart, but there are some receivers there, Mike. Who should we be keeping our eyes on other than Ashton Hawkins right now, who right now probably is the consensus top option at receiver right now, at least from a security standpoint of no, he's probably going to be one of the guys locked into the starting spots.
Yeah, if we haven't switched it around, we're going to switch it around. Ashton Hawkins is going to start in the slot. He has some flexibility to go outside too, but I'm pretty sure he's going to start in the slot. Outside, if you get to rounds 29, 30, that range, I might take a shot on Bo Corrales, who transferred in from SMU. Julian Ortega-Jones from Bowling Green, who's been in the program, but he flashed during the spring. The last two wide receiver ones for Mac Leftwich, the offensive coordinator, have been outside receivers. So I would take a shot maybe on an explosive guy on the outside, like a Corrales or Julian Ortega-Jones once you get really late in drafts.
Yep. Look, Mike, that's it. That ran us. We've gone through all the teams. We're through the Group of Five conference, man. Is there anything that we missed here in the Sun Belt? Anything overlying theme as we were going through this conference that you want to just kind of point out and maybe put a bow on it from your end before we kind of close things out here?
No, I mean, Rasheen Ali, potential running back 1 over Quinshon Judkins, I think is something that is very feasible this year. And then that Texas, we closed it out with Texas State. I think that situation at quarterback is going to be really interesting to follow. And who knows, maybe what if they're not, we talked about this with a couple teams, Old Dominion and then in some other podcasts. What if they're not good in year one? Then people wasted a lot of draft capital on some of those players. So it'll be interesting to track during the regular season.
Well, look, man, that's it. We're through the G5. Now on to the Power 5. And, it's interesting, I'd like to think that we get a lot of listens, but because so many guys love the full FBS formats, but we know that we definitely get more eyes and ears when we get to the Power 5, just for the guys that sort of simplify their leagues and stay with the big boys. So look, man, that's going to do it. We're through the G5. That's going to do it for our preseason preview series on the Sun Belt. And next time Mike and I are behind the microphone and in front of the camera, we're going to get into the Power 5 conferences and we're going to kick things off with the ACC. So until next time, guys, we'll see you.